I remember the first time I heard of Dark Souls. Not Demon Souls, Dark Souls. It was, ironically, from Kevin Van Ord's review for GameSpot. Back then, I was just a kid who had to work at my dad's small business mom and pop style clothing shop every Sunday, and it sucked. Which meant I spent as much time as I could scrolling GameSpot, just clicking on random games, and going straight to the big number at the bottom to see the official score, and to read the pros and cons list. And only then, if I was interested, would I read the actual review. Dark Souls, though, was one of those games where I did go back. The truth is, I just thought the cover looked really cool. The review made it clear that you were supposed to die, a concept I had a bare minimum of understanding because I severely underestimated just how much dying mattered, and it would be woven into the DNA of Dark Souls, and by design, every other FromSoft game ever released. As I grew older, I managed to avoid experiencing Dark Souls, but I kept hearing about it. Eventually, I saw a spine-chilling trailer for Dark Souls 3. One of the most beautiful things I had seen at an E3 reveal in a long time. And in fact, you know what? I'm just gonna let this specific part play out so you can get into the headspace that I was in.
And so it is that ash seeketh embers.
Yeah, amazing, right? It was at this time that I realized I had to dip my toes into the water. I was still very unsure about what to expect, but there was something very clear that I did know. Very little can compete in being a hardcore gamer than beating a Souls game for those who have respect for difficulty. I've seen these games churn out more quitters than any other series in existence, having enraged many and charming far more masochists than I ever imagined. And there are very few games that can push the human limit of patience the way that FromSoft games do. They are fucking difficult and are notorious for their difficulty. If you know, you absolutely know. And if you don't, here's why these games can be suffocating. And not all of this applies universally across every FromSoft game, but they absolutely apply to at least one, if not the majority. For starters, the very base minions of any given location can be punishing if you are unprepared. Sure, they are easy to handle, especially one-on-one, but all it takes in a SoulsBorne game is one mistake. Literally. You will be punished in ways that you did not expect. Maybe the minion decided to go into an enraged frenzy out of nowhere, or you dropped your guard or took your eye off your stamina meter. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of catalysts that only lead to your current run ending in a damning death screen. The game is also resolute in telling you nothing other than the barest of item descriptions, the basic controls, and your stats with minimal context, and expecting you to be paying close attention the whole time to your environment, surroundings, and even the dialogue of the NPCs that you encounter. It is this silent game logic and language that kickstarts the difficulty. The more you play, the less this applies, but especially for new players, you have to learn from scratch, and they might not understand the significance of things like what causes enemies to stagger, their weaknesses, resistance, how level scaling works, what key items or NPC summons are available, and what their quests even do, all without a quest log. The different damage types, commitment to certain weapon upgrades or builds with limited resources, I mean the list goes on. Then tack on a few other ingredients into the pot, like having limited health flasks, constant risk of losing valuable currency upon death, which is needed for both item purchases and more importantly stat upgrades, no pause button, a very shit lock-on camera that flips you when you need it the most, some garbage glitches or physics that the game will simply not forgive you for, despite of no fault of your own by the way, as well as not telling you that some bosses or even whole areas that are causing you to wipe for the 50th time might not even be mandatory or even necessary in the first place. Then consider the lengthy traversal between the fog walls or save points and shortcuts, the intimidating and oppressive environments, the clinically insane bosses with second and sometimes even third phases, and you have now scratched just the tip of the iceberg of why the Souls games are some of the most demanding, insufferable, and controversial. It is no surprise then that every release kickstarts the same discourse, a firestorm debate of difficulty and how tough is too tough. The discourse for me means nothing, and it drives me insane. And the reason the whole "are Souls games too difficult" discourse bothers me is because honestly it does not matter. Because the difficulty in these games are never, and I repeat, never, consistent. The metric of difficulty that you are dealing with in one FromSoft game gets completely converted the moment that another release happens. Like, okay, don't worry though, I too am also in the camp that these games don't need an easy mode, but it's not because I think being able to platinum these games makes me God or scratches my ego. No, it's because I think the gatekeepers are stupid for being so smug in the first place, because almost every Souls game has key areas, bosses, or moments that are fucking cheesable. If you can cheese a boss and take the piss out of it, then your high horse means nothing to me. It's also such a shitty attitude to have, the whole prepare to die bros. Not every game is meant for every person, I agree, and that is okay. But just because you mastered the FromSoft formula does not make you inherently better. The sooner that we can all accept this, the faster the stupid difficulty discourse can die, and we can approach the game as it was originally intended. Now, Demon's Souls was the first seed that all of this branched out of, but Dark Souls was the hit single that put this franchise on the map. Despite that legacy, it's not really Dark Souls that I hear everyone talk about fondly the most, but Bloodborne, which was interesting. Really, if you think about it, every sequential release seemed like it was meant to address the muscle memory built from the prior games and to flip them on their head. For example, if you would allow me to meme a little for a second, if I were to define each Souls game with a one summation description, it would probably go like this. Dark Souls. It's soul-crushing, isn't it? Bloodborne. Okay, stop using your shield and spamming your dodge roll. Please attack. Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 3. Okay, alright, sorry, we hear you. You hated DS2, we get it. It's soul crush. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Guys, it's in the title, okay? Dying is irrelevant, stop f***ing dodge rolling. And Demon's Souls Remaster. Hey, did you know the DualSense has haptic feedback? Now, regardless of all the bullshit and issues I mentioned earlier, at the end of the day, the game is designed to be beaten. It wants to be beaten. It's inviting you to beat it. It spits in your face after it beats you down, but it also wants you to get back up and clock it, knocking it out cold in retaliation, so long you have the will and the strength to muster the punch. If you do choose to swing back, and more importantly, if you connect, it is really hard to explain the emotion when it works. Euphoria is the closest word I can think of. Relief is a close second. Not every boss has given me this feeling of euphoria. In fact, plenty of bosses felt like garbage, and I had no joy even in victory. In fact, I would be pissed and livid and furious that I had to wade through all the bullshit to deal with the boss in the first place. But every single time, without a doubt, there was always a hint of relief in me. For the instances where the boss fight was so good that I did feel the euphoria, I need you to know how addicting and good it is. It's like the video game version of a drug. There's a routine to these emotions as you fight. You try to stay composed, and it takes you only so far before you start to feel the cracks of agony. And it's like the game can fucking tell, by the way, because almost immediately, the moment that you do panic, it feels like the boss's behavior just starts to change. Almost like it can sense your impending victory or its own, and it banks on your composure starting to crack. One of the best examples of this, and something I also literally felt in my bones, was the Genichiro fight from Sekiro. I strongly recommend you read the official review, but my summation of it from memory is that you go from an ironclad composure to absolute panic that evolves into a flow state off of pure muscle memory, instinct, and sheer desperation. Tamura wrote that in the review, and to me, it is a beautiful analogy that perfectly sums up just what it means to go through the ringer of a SoulsBorne game. Then there's the satisfaction of an experiment that succeeds. Maybe you were using the wrong damage type on an enemy, and that's why they felt invulnerable. A few tweaks of your toolkit, and suddenly the gates seem to open. Maybe you needed to take some time and backtrack or explore elsewhere, which led you to stumble on an item or NPC or side quest, resulting in a summon to help lift the weight off your shoulders when you revisit the boss. Maybe you were just at an unfortunate level check, and you had to hunker down to farm some souls for a bit to get your stamina or health high enough to where you could actually tank an extra attack, tilting the scales in your favor. Whatever the setbacks or reason for them, finding the light at the end of the tunnel is an incredible feeling. There's also the beauty of the games. For every oppressive location, there are also just inexplicable moments of reprieve and rest, the symbolism of which weighs heavy on you and your player. Even the scariest swamps, or spider nests, cave, or castle have their own beauty among all the rotten death. It is hard to explain until you actually play it, but some of the visual beauty is easily translated just by glancing at the art design. More importantly, victory comes in more forms than simply beating a boss. It could be having a gut decision about an NPC pay off in the long run, seeing a seemingly inconsequential decision earlier pay dividends down the road. It could even just be revisiting old areas that used to torture you just for you to then waltz through them with ease. The game grants you moments to get cocky, even though that's also part of its grand scheme to then humble you down the road, but more on that later. The first FromSoft game I ever played was Bloodborne, and it wasn't the wrong choice, but there is a universal truth here among my friends. Your first SoulsBorne game you play will almost always end up being your least favorite at first, because it's the first game that you are swept down the current with no chance to understand the whys of it all, other than through suffering and perseverance, which is easier said than done. Meaning, I hated Bloodborne. Every FromSoft flaw was hitting me in Bloodborne with absolute force and no room for mercy. Every instance I asked, why is this broken, from the game's physics to the game logic, none of my concerns mattered, because it was all met with a defiant silence from the game, demanding me to play with the rules it set for me. Rules that the game itself would not always play with. At this time, the Sekiro hype began and quickly grew out of control. To give you some insight into what was going on at GameSpot at the time, we were all fighting for codes internally because we only got a limited amount and everyone wanted to play Sekiro. It was here that my boss at the time basically told me, hey, if you get a code, be prepared because you are now in it for the long haul. Meaning, in short, I had to beat the game or I would look like a chump. So I had an extra chip on my shoulder. No matter what, I resolved to myself, I would beat this game. I quickly fell in love with Sekiro, hated the game for similar issues I had with Bloodborne, but still loved it. I had the benefit of talking shop with colleagues, hearing their tips and tricks and what they learned or discovered, and eventually down the line, Sekiro became the first Souls game that I not only beat, but would platinum, meaning I beat it 3 more times. It was here that I realized something important. Sekiro was different enough to where I had to unlearn things from Bloodborne and Dark Souls, and if I were to play Elden Ring right away, I would most likely lose enjoyment playing the older games, because I would constantly be comparing them to the quality of life positive changes of the later games. And you know what? I made the right choice, because I went back to the drawing board and played the games in the following order. Bloodborne, only because I was already 3/4 of the way done, DS1 Remastered, DS2 Scholar of the First Sin, which I had no idea was actually supposed to be the hard one, DS3 Demon's Souls Remake, and then I did a false start with Elden Ring where I began but quickly stopped because my roommate kept infuriatingly backseat gaming and I just took a full-on 1-year break. Well, after all the hype had come and gone and Elden Ring had won every Game of the Year award across the board, I was here, ready to play Elden Ring finally, alone and in peace. But before I started for real, I decided to make a commitment to myself. I would go blind as far as I could, just pure exploration and experimentation. With my mind blissfully purged of Elden Ring, I had a chance to properly sit down and digest before me the most incredible opening cutscene of any FromSoft game I have ever witnessed. I mean, all the opening cutscenes from these games are just peak, but the music and the narrator for Elden Ring took this to a whole absolute other level. The moment that they said,
"Oh, rise now, ye tarnished, ye dead who yet live."
Guys, I can't even begin to tell you how fast that chill went down my spine. Hearing their names screamed out like Horaloo and Sir Gideon Ofnir, the All-Knowing. I literally got chills writing this, and now even just reading this script out loud, I got another chill. Like, fuck, dude, this is so good. A quick tutorial and a few additions to the gameplay that I was not expecting, like the combat ash skills or the quick action pouch, and I made my way for the Elden Ring's Breath of the Wild moment, where you open the doors to Limgrave and bask in your first sight of grace, with just a silent nudge to the direction that you should probably go. If I go into detail on everything this game did that caught my attention, or made me jot a note down, this video would be over 2 hours long. I kid you not, I have hardly ever seen a game so dense at first glance as a new player, and it all came from the open world design, the no holds barred to its exploration. It all felt so unlimited and chaotic and yet natural at the same time. You couldn't go 2 steps without being pulled in another direction with the allure of cool items, weapons, runes, or a challenge. Then, add on to the fact there's a whole underground. Chests that teleport you, portals that teleport you, a map that is deceptive and keeps getting bigger and bigger, just an incredible scale and size that keeps surprising you as you explore more. Even better, and to my absolute surprise, there were forgiving quality of life improvements, this time such as renewing your flask if you defeat a squad of enemies, Stake of Maracas that acted like additional mini checkpoints, usually conveniently placed right before a mini-boss or an environment with a small army of enemies. All these improvements, man, they came as a result of FromSoft seemingly adding so much size and depth with the open world, because otherwise it would just be way too oppressive. Then one of the most dramatic and significant changes to Elden Ring was made clear. Torrent, your dutiful steed who would help you blaze past dangerous swaths of patrolling enemies, scale up and down treacherous cliffs, and hilariously sometimes even just leap high into the air at certain points of the game if you knew where to look. Torrent's mobility added an extra dimension to the core loop of Elden Ring in a way that not only impressed me, but felt natural after an hour or two of adjustments. I spent just as often fighting bosses while riding Torrent than I did leaping off of him to finish off a blow on solid ground. In fact, Torrent was the reason I ventured off and used a weapon I would have never used before, a flail. And not only did it become a weapon I trusted in my life in multiple times, but it made combat off horseback so sick and cool and just fun. There's a brilliant placement of practically everything that is important in your pathway, particularly people and items. It's incredible, especially when considering how huge the map is, because almost by accident, you seem to stumble on things just as you need them, which is no small feat. In a game that you could turn on its head by going wherever you want, you still somehow are pulled in the correct path more or less. The distinct bosses are exactly that, beautifully distinct, although not every boss stands out. The demigods, which are essentially the big main bosses, are some of the best and coolest I've ever played, and I found them refreshingly different from the now overplayed and overhyped standard boss fight that any FromSoft veteran can practically do with their eyes closed. Did that mean that the big main bosses were pushovers? Nope, not at all. Not for me. But again, despite crutching on this myself every single time, I am wary of doing the constant dodge roll plus circle around the boss and keep hugging their leg for damage. There's still a place for it, but variety is the spice of life. So my jaw dropped the first time I spotted Renala, and my excitement grew even more when I saw her fight second phase. The setting, the art, the aura, it was magnificent. Sure, a lot of Elden Ring seems to be directly lifted from other FromSoft games. In the case of Renala, you can spot the DNA of the fight with Rom from Bloodborne, but I still loved it. Many of the other demigods or shardbearers were standout encounters as well that had an extra twist to their fight, making it feel special. Rykard, a figure outcast as blasphemous, had you use a specific item that manifested itself into a god-slaying armament. Renala felt like a mini puzzle before her second fight, which fit a more traditional encounter. But like I said, the classic Soul-style fighting was still present. Godric the Grafted and Margit had movesets that I felt I had seen before, and then literally saw again with Morgoth the Omen King. There are lore reasons for the similarities, and in some cases repeatable smaller bosses, but among all of them, it was the demigod or shardbearer fights that gave me the most trouble and the most joy. I'll mention the elephant in the room right now, and it was that by waiting, I got to fight Millennia in a way that did not feel insanely unfair. I heard rumors that her fight was bugged back in the day, and that her waterfowl attack or some other kind of attack would heal her, even if you weren't hit, which is legitimately unfair. But thankfully, I did not encounter that at all. In fact, for her fight, I got her to the second phase and then promptly died. And I then would not taste the second phase for at least an entire day or two before fighting tooth and nail towards victory. Her fight was absolutely one of the more difficult ones in the game without a doubt, but beyond that wicked cool waterfowl move and her notoriety, it did not feel that out of place or as much of an outlier when placed against the larger Elden Ring backdrop. Now, moving away from the boss fights and into the world of Elden Ring, the universe and story shattered the soul with a sense of grandiosity, and half the time I didn't know what was happening, but I was desperately unearthing as much as I could to learn more and make connections among all the threads the game wove in front of me. When I played, I sought out every cave, every dragon, every mini-boss, and every location and side quest that I could. And by the end, I got pretty far, only to see that I'd missed just a small handful of optional bosses that I would then look up once I was sure I had reached the final encounter. The weapons and incantations in this game and the combat just felt so good, and the ability to go in over-leveled near the end also felt like a huge weight lifted off me. Although I wasn't particularly satisfied with that, but more on that later. Without a doubt, the lasting impression given to me felt like this was the ultimate FromSoft masterpiece. If you were curious, my build was a heavy Dex Faith build, and I respec just once to retune some of my stat points out of Intelligence and Arcane and back into Health and Stamina before a particularly challenging fight against Mog, the Lord of Blood. Off the heels of every fantastic fight came the synergy of crafting, the available items, the cool abilities, faith incantations, sorceries, some really cool weapons, and their special abilities known as Ash of Wars. Add on the Phantom Spirits, which I thought were really cool and unique, and the culmination of all of these components made the Elden Ring combat and gameplay loop easily my favorite of all time, out of any Souls game I had played so far. I wanted to start off with the beautiful parts of the game so there would be no question as to where my opinions lie. I love this game, and I found it to be one of the best games I ever played. But I will not lie to you. Just because this game was a masterpiece, it did not mean that the experience was not rocky, or that the game is perfect, because it is not. There are, as is the nature of FromSoft games, glaring problems, some of them unintentional, many of them meant to frustrate. To start with the things I disliked, I know why they named the characters the way they did, and I don't know if I should blame this guy, or Miyazaki, but to hell with all of the G and M in our names. Again, I know why. It's lineage and story connections, but all it did for the longest time was confuse the hell out of me. Tell me for real, while you're fighting for your life trying to navigate a stupendously large world, can you tell me the difference between Godric, Godfrey, Godwin, Gideon, Renala, Rena, Ronnie, Roderica, Rhea, Rykard, Radon, Marika, Millicent, Michaela, Milena, Melania, Margit, Morgott, Moog, Malekith? Like, fuck off, dude. The letters, from what I understand, are meant to indicate family trees and relationships, but it was obnoxious, if I'm being honest, and it did the opposite for me. Rather than clarify, it just gave a vague thread of connection, and more often than not, had me confuse several names and characters with each other. Beyond that, the obvious complaint, which should be nothing new to anyone who remains unbiased playing through older FromSoft games, is the balance and scaling. It is completely out of whack. Early game builds are so broken that they become crutches and trivialize the game, and for me this was the move Bloody Slash. And then by then it's only a matter of time before you find your next crutch, and your next, and your next. But don't be fooled, it wasn't all easy, because there would be ridiculous choke points on the opposite end of the spectrum. And they felt absurdly hard out of nowhere. This wasn't a Super Mario game where you went from 4-2 to 4-3, but rather 4-2 to 8-1, seemingly at random. This was the only downside to the massive open world nature of the game. By not restricting you, the experience gets wonky if you choose to explore and you aren't challenged in a way that I think you should be at times. Notice I say at times, because for the most part, it all feels good, or as fair as it should be, but then there are these frustrating moments where you just steamroll a boss only to find that same boss later, except it's got the same moveset, the same look, the same everything, but for whatever reasons, it is 30 times harder. In short, it feels like if you rush, you get punished, which makes sense. But if you explore, you become too over-leveled for certain areas very fast, and for me, it didn't allow me to develop a sense of pace to the game, making the different level check moments way too jarring. I also was less impressed by the sheer number of bosses because a lot of them felt bloated. Seeing the words enemy felled means nothing, especially after the 100th time, and even more especially when I'm bullying them and their repeats. It's like telling your significant other you love them 20 times a day. The word loses the meaning, and enemy felled lost its meaning to me midway through. Co-op is also a niche that I do not care for, and I hope you don't yell at me in the comments for this, but I've never been interested in PvP. I found invasions to be toxic, but funny in hindsight. The only problem is there are way too many loops and hoops to work with just to get co-op to work together, whether it's to grief a new player or to try and play with your friends. These games in my mind were crafted and designed to be played solo, with the whispers of multiplayer focused on messages littered on the ground, either helpful or trolling, and the occasional boss summon. But the messages, I legitimately think, are stupid. They've gotten too out of hand, and 9 times out of 10 you are dealing with messages that feel like a circle jerk Reddit post meant to karma farm and nothing else. As for the other issues, then there are the familiar FromSoft trappings. This fucking camera, for example. Sometimes it is just the worst, nothing else to say about it. Might get caught or can't figure out which enemy you're supposed to lock on, especially in the heat of battle, and I just don't like it. The other FromSoft problem I keep referring to throughout this vid is how the games will give you a set of rules to play with, but then they simply will not obey those very same rules. The first time I raged happened during that Renala fight. I went from high off life at how gorgeous the fight was, to being enraged over an unfair moment. The short of it was this. I killed the boss, and in her stupid grandstanding death monologue, her latest summon slaughtered me. And the game was too stupid to process what was what, so it gave me the clear, but it took away all of the runes I earned. And when I respawned, it was impossible to go back to the fight because the game considered the boss beaten and the arena therefore inaccessible. I know 40,000 runes means nothing when you play long enough. At the time though, 40,000 runes meant everything, and I was furious. This problem would happen again and again and again, with enemies being defeated but still somehow managing to kill me from the grave, and the game just could not tell the difference. It sucks, because this is not a get good moment. I did get fucking good. I literally killed the fucking boss. At least give me a shot to refight it, or load an older checkpoint, or just spawn those goddamn runes next to the site of grace. It's obtuse and outdated, it's a problem, and it does not belong. But FromSoft can get away with it because it just adds to the unrelenting and oppressive, quote, difficulty of the game. And again, man, I know the runes aren't a big deal, but this isn't about the runes, it's about the principle. This isn't difficulty or a genuine challenge anymore. It is cheap. Do not confuse the two. Or consider in combat, when you get staggered. The game exaggerates every death, making it only seem like if you just spam the buttons you can break out of your daze, but no, you are still literally vulnerable and the other enemies will more often than not pounce on you, or the boss will painstakingly take down your health in one move that seems to be more like 5. The moment you flip the rules and use what they've done to you onto them, well, it doesn't matter anymore. For example, getting a critical hit feels incredible. Watching the big enemy or the boss stagger and fall down, this feels good. But rather than reward you, a bullshit thing happens because they just get to be invincible while they're immobile on the ground for whatever reason. It's garbage, because you certainly don't get that benefit when you are staggered or thrown on the ground, right? Honestly, there's dozens of issues like this that I can nitpick, and they can only be summed up in a way that I've said countless times before. If it is a FromSoft game, expect the game to enforce the rules for you without question, and to completely ignore those very same rules otherwise, more often than not, to your disadvantage. All in all, Elden Ring is a breathtaking game though. Don't let my complaints imply otherwise. It is a beautiful game. It invites, it punishes, and it inspires. For FromSoft, Elden Ring was a genuine leap into uncharted territory, and despite the familiar pitfalls, the overwhelming success is well deserved. FromSoft already has an authentic stamp on their games that the other Souls-like games scramble over themselves to try and emulate. You can make all the copies you want, but there's always only one original. Elden Ring improves on the traditional FromSoft formula in almost every aspect, though I anticipate their next game to return to their roots, which won't be an unwelcome change. That being said, at the end of the day, Elden Ring still stands triumphant, and in comparison, it makes every other wannabe FromSoft clone look like the copycats that they are. Until next time.